Now today I'm going to do a little bit on phase transitions because the BU syllabus, I mean, like it doesn't deal much with phase transitions. Okay, at least maybe in the elective for CMP, but right now it's not there in any of the general papers. So what I'll do is, I told you I'd do electronics question. So I'll keep that pending because I want to discuss this phase transitions in detail. There are lots of questions in that coming up. Okay, so now I'll just just a second. I'll just admit this person. Okay, yeah. Okay, so now I'll start with the questions. Okay, so today's set of questions. Okay, so this is the first question. Scattering is always accompanied by, you have a phase shift, reaction, absorption, and a new particle creation. So what I've realized is, for those who've taken this nuclear elective, okay, they're going to get confused with scattering is always accompanied by, they're going to get confused with this. Okay, they're going to start choosing reaction and absorption. So basically, there are these two things that that are added up to the total cross section. Okay, so that in one situation you have your reaction cross section and your absorption cross section coming up. Okay, along with your scattering cross section. That together, all of that together makes up your total cross section. So what I realized is that many people start thinking in terms of nuclear physics, and then they automatically start responding with reaction or absorption here. Now, what you should think of is in terms of simple scattering. Okay, scattering is always accompanied by. So when you're looking at your, let me just take the annotate. Okay, so when you're looking at your incident particle, basically you have something like e to the power of I k dot r. Okay, so this is how your incident wave is being represented. Now, what you will end up getting is there's going to be a phase shift in this wave. Okay, when scattering occurs, there's going to be a phase shift that occurs in this incident particle. So you're supposed to be breaking it down into simpler terms and looking at elementary scattering theory rather than going into high level of nuclear kind of thinking. Okay, so scattering here is always accompanied by phase shift. Okay, so even if you look at it naturally, that's the answer you're supposed to be coming to. Okay, so I will just move on to the next slide. Okay, so you look at basic elementary scattering theory. Okay, so when you have a scattered wave, is always accompanied by a change in phase with respect to the incoming wave. Okay, so the outgoing wave is going to have a phase change with respect to your incoming wave. Okay, now let's go on to this. Okay, this is something called the optical theorem, and I'm sure the second semester students would have done it already. So now what they're going to ask you is the formula for this. Okay, there is an ambiguity in this question because they've just said optical theorem. Okay, the answers they've given here is basically, I mean, like, it's just basically variance of the cross section that they've got in only a particular case where you have a plane wave that's going to be incident. Okay, so if you have a wave other than that, there is another formula that was given by Heisenberg, and we're not going to go into details of that, but I'll just tell you, I just wanted to make sure that you know that only when you have a plane wave will you end up getting some kind of a cross section like this. Okay, so this is the answer. It's answer B. Okay, so I will just move on to this. Okay, so your optical theorem here is the general law of scattering theory, which relates the forward scattering amplitude to the total cross section of the scatterer. Okay, so here, if you look at these options, forward scattering amplitude f of theta to the total cross section sigma. Okay, so that's what you have there. Okay, and it's written in this form: sigma is equal to 4 pi divided by k, your imaginary part of your f of theta. Theta is your scattering amplitude with angle of incidence 0. K is your wave vector to the incident direction. And now let's look at this. Okay, so note that the above form is only for an incident plane wave. Okay, so that is something that you have to keep in mind. So in the other case, you're going to have a k prime dotted with a k, and things like that are going to come in, and it's going to be a little more bigger compared to this one. Okay, so outgoing directions are generally denoted by k prime, and this is done by Heisenberg. Okay, so now let's move on to the next one. Okay, so Born approximation is applicable for scattering by. I don't know if you recall this, in the second semester, there was this huge derivation on Born approximation, which involved Green's function, which involved trying to find out the value of the complex number inside a plane and outside a plane and things like that. Okay, so the benefit of using this Green's function is basically you will be able to convert a differential equation into an integral form. Okay, and then you'll be able to kind of evaluate it over the entire set of volume, including your boundary. Okay, evaluate that integral over the entire volume as well as your boundary. So that's why you basically use Green's function. Okay, so now let's look at this. Your Born approximation is applicable for scattering by low Z targets at high energy, low Z targets at low energy, low Z targets at high energy, high Z targets at high energy, and high Z targets at low energy. So what your Z here is doing is your atomic number is doing it, it's giving you the potential. Okay, so your atomic number basically tells you about your potential. Tells you about the potential, about your potential. Okay, so that's what your Z value is doing. Okay, and this one basically your high energy, this is referring to your incident particle. Okay, so let's look at this. The integral form of your potential scattering is more suitable in your scattering experiments. The benefit of the integral equation is that it applies throughout the volume, okay, throughout the volume, including your boundary too, okay, and this is suitable for your successive approximation. Now, your Born approximation, I hope you realize there are like several sets of Born approximations. So first order approximation, second order, and until your nth order, okay? So you keep, what do? You take the first one and you put it back into the second one, and then find out the second approximation. Then you take the second one, put it back into the third one, and then you find that approximation out. Okay, so now the Born approximation is valid for large incident energies and weak scattering potential. Okay, so potentials related to your Z. Weaker scattering potentials refers to low atomic number. Higher the scattering potentials refers to a high value of Z. Now, I don't know if you recall doing this. Second semester students, you should probably be like really fresh with it because you just finished that part. Okay, so what you do is you take your Born approximation and apply it to a Coulomb potential. What you see is you get your Rutherford's formula back. Okay, so you take your Born approximation and you apply it to a particular potential called the Coulomb potential, and then you end up getting your Rutherford's formula back. Okay, so that's another interesting thing. Okay, so when the average interaction energy between your incident particle and the scattering potential is much smaller than the particle's incident kinetic energy, the scattering wave can be considered to be a plane wave. Okay, so let's decompose that a bit. You have a particle here and you say you have a target here. Okay, so because of this Z value, there's going to be some kind of a potential that's going to be here. Okay, so this guy is going to be interacting with the potential, and now this interaction should be, just a second, I've got a notification here. Okay, somebody entered and then they left. Okay, so the average interaction energy between your incident particle and the scattering potential should be much smaller than the particle's incident energy. Okay, so the average interaction energy between your incident particle and the scattering potential should be much smaller than your incident and your kinetic energy. Okay, so that's what this is about. So your larger incident energy, that's basically referring to the kinetic energy of the particle. Your weak scattering potential is referring to the potential around this target that you have. Okay, so now let's move to this. Okay, so if you take your Born approximation and apply it to this Coulomb potential, it ends up giving the Rutherford formula, like I told you before. Okay, so now let's look at this. Okay, so I'm giving you a set of formulae that we can do. like that we can apply if we want to do an approximation for a particular potential. So here you have a method. This is a method of successive approximation, basically a way to handle your integral equation. So you're looking at a 0th order approximation. This ignores the presence of the target. So what you entirely get is basically the incident wave itself, okay, the plane wave itself. So here I've assumed that it's along the z direction, so that's why this e to the power of ikz comes. And as we go on to further approximations, we have more and more scattered terms. Okay. So now this is the first order approximation that you have. Your psi, your first order, is equal to e to the power of ikz, which is basically this value, minus m divided by 2 pi h cross squared, integral of e to the power of ik, vector r minus vector r naught divided by the same thing, v of r naught into psi 0 r0 d cubed of r naught. So what's going to be changing here is basically this. Okay. So now here you've taken this psi 0, you've taken this and you've inputted this into this function. So the next thing that you're going to get, you're going to use psi 2 of r vector is equal to e to the power of ikz minus m divided by 2 pi h cross squared. You get the same integral e to the power of I r vector minus r naught divided by r vector minus r vector naught. And then you end up getting your v naught of this, and then you have a 0. What do you take? You take your psi 1 of r and input it back here. Okay, so you have a psi 2 of r vector, and then you have a d cubed r vector of 0. Okay, so and then you find out the nth order approximation, and this goes on. Okay, so the number of approximations that you find out basically depend on the value of your potential. Okay, so the stronger your potential, the more number of approximations that will come up. The weaker the potential, the less the number of approximations, and then you can be done with your calculations. Okay. So this is the second order and your nth order approximations. Okay. So now let's move on to the next question. Okay. So the dancing motion of a Dirac electron is called Bremsstrahlung, Zitterbewegung, helicity, or oscillation. Okay, so if you know German, you basically don't need to know physics. Okay, so in German, your Bremsstrahlung is basically braking radiation. Okay, if you translate it, that's what it means, braking radiation. And Zitterbewegung basically means jittering motion along a path. Okay, so your dancing motion of a Dirac electron is basically Zitterbewegung. Okay, it's basically jittering motion along a path. Okay, so let's just look at this. Okay, so your Zitterbewegung basically means jittering motion, is a predicted rapid oscillatory motion of elementary particles that obey your relativistic wave equation. So I hope you know that you have two different kinds of relativistic wave equations. One is the Klein-Gordon equation. We come to that, right? We'll come to that in a couple of questions. And the other one is your Dirac equation. Okay. Then you have another one where you have your non-relativistic equation. Okay, so basically why this came up is, okay, for your Dirac electron is because when Dirac actually formulated this Dirac equation, basically he took it specifically for your electrons. Okay, so that's why they always associated with Dirac electron or Dirac C, all those kinds of terminologies come up. Okay. So here, now let's look at this. Okay, so this was proposed by Erwin Schrödinger as a result of his analysis of the wave packet solutions of the Dirac equation for relativistic electrons in free space. Okay, now let's look at Bremsstrahlung. Okay, the idea is not to just look at the correct answer. The idea is also to look at the answers that are, the options that are given to you, because I've realized that just by doing that, you can explore a whole lot of other bunch of questions that come up. Okay, so now the thing is that if a question on Bremsstrahlung comes up, you can answer that too. Okay, so Bremsstrahlung, which basically means braking radiation or decelerating radiation, is a type of electromagnetic radiation that is produced due to the deceleration of a charged particle when diffracted by another charged particle, basically like an electron in an atomic nucleus. Okay. Okay. Okay, so what happens here is the moving particle loses the kinetic energy, which is basically converted into radiation, and therefore it basically does not violate the law of conservation of energy there, okay, even in the case of your Bremsstrahlung. Okay, so now let's move on to this next question. Okay, so I hope you remember your Pauli's matrices and the trick to remember them and all, because the Dirac matrices are basically 4x4 versions of your Pauli matrices. Okay, so let's just look into this. Okay, so the Dirac matrices are 0 trace unit square 4x4 matrices, unit trace 0 square 4x4 matrices, 0 trace unit square 2x2 matrices, and unit trace 0 square 2x2 matrices. Okay, so let's look at this. The Dirac matrices are of this form. Okay, so Dirac matrices are basically expanded versions. Like, you have to take your Pauli's matrices and put them into your Dirac matrices and then make it into a 4x4 matrix. Okay, so you remember that all the Pauli's matrices that you had are basically 2x2, right? So basically you had a sigma x, which gave you, let's remember how to do it. So basically it's the opposite of your unit matrix. So you had 0, 1, 1, 0. And then you had sigma y, which is equal to 0 minus I 0. And then you have your sigma z, which is basically your unit matrix with a negative sign. Okay, so these are your Pauli's matrices. Now, what do you basically do? This is basically sigma x, sigma y, or sigma z, x, y, or z. So you take those 2x2 matrices and put it onto that. Okay, so I will show you the expanded version in a while. Okay, so these are your sigma Pauli's matrices. Okay, so now what you can identify here is that your trace here is 0. Trace is what? Sum of the diagonal elements. So your trace here is 0. Okay, here too your trace is 0. Now this is basically, it wouldn't have been properly written. So basically this is your identity matrix. So this, including your identity matrix, is the entire set. Okay, so you basically have 1, 0, 0, 1 here. I'll just write 1 for you, which is easier to do. And then you have this. Okay, so you end up getting 4x4 matrices. And now if you take the sum along this, you're going to get a 0. Okay, so let's go back and let's just look at the question. Okay, so you have 0 trace that you figured out now. What are they? 4x4 matrices. So 0 trace unit square 4x4 matrices. Okay, so now let's look at this. Okay, there is another name for this. So these are also called as gamma matrices. Okay, and they are written in a covariant form. So if you've done relativistic electrodynamics properly in your second sem, which is a topic that usually most students just leave off, you will come up with certain notations like this. So you get a gamma naught, gamma 0, gamma 1, gamma 2, and gamma 3. So basically this is the beta that we wrote. Okay, different books have different notations for this. This was the beta that we wrote, and all of these were basically your alpha vectors that we wrote. Okay, so let's move to the next one. Okay, so these are the 4x4 contravariant gamma matrices. Okay, so basically when you learn your electrodynamics, there's going to be time-like, space-like, and light-like coming up. Okay, so these are basically gamma 0, which is your time-like and Hermitian matrix. The others are like space-like and anti-Hermitian matrices. Okay, so just look up your time-like, space-like, and light-like. Okay, so now here, this question is already repeated. Okay, so I hope you remember this. The reason I'm repeating this is because it's like a revision to kind of like, you know, go through those concepts once again so that it kind of like stays in your head. Now, I realize the same question in this 2013 paper has been written twice. Okay, so it's like if you crack one question, you get the answer automatically for the next question. So the same question has been repeated in paper 3 too. Okay, we did the same question in paper 2, and in paper 3 too it has been repeated. Okay, so the vectors of dual vector spaces are called. You had a Ket vector, Bra vector, Dirac vector, and Poisson vector. Okay, So here what they've missed is, I think they've not written, your Dirac vectors can also be called as your Rocket vectors, right? So you end up choosing that option rather than looking at what dual space really means, okay? So what you're supposed to remember is it is a linear functional from one space, let's say V is some complex space, to the actual complex space, okay? So V is some set of all complex variables to another complex space. So this is basically your bra vector, okay? So if V, a little v, is represented as your bra vector, you're taking it as a functional from V to your complex vector space. We've done this before, so I'll just quickly go through that. Okay, so the dual vector spaces to a real vector space V is the vector space of linear functions f from V to R, okay, and it's denoted by V star. Similarly, you can do the same thing. Instead of V being real, you can take a complex vector space and put it to C, okay? Now, how is your bra vector a dual vector? Okay, so this is all the notations of your bra vector. So a bra vector looks like this, and you can mathematically denote it as a linear functional. So this is very important, linear functional from F, V to your C. So it's like a linear map that maps one vector V to a number in your complex plane C. Okay. So I just quickly went through that because we've already done it before. Okay. So now this is quite simple. What do you mean by orthogonal? Okay, so if you take your scalar product, basically if you take an A dot B, you realize that A, B, if you want them to be orthogonal, you want this to be about 90 degrees. So your A dot B should be equal to 0, right? So a bra and a ket vector, okay, is orthogonal. They've messed up the grammar here, okay? A bra and ket vector is orthogonal if, let's look at the options, their vector product is 0, their scalar product is 0, their scalar sum is 0, all of the above are valid, okay? So what do you mean by vector product? Okay, so when will the vector product be 0? So if you have an A cross B, you basically end up getting an A, B sine theta with an n cap, right? So this will only be 0 when you have 0. That means they have to be parallel. Okay, so what about the other case? They have to be AB. Okay, so their scalar product cannot, if they have to be orthogonal to each other, the scalar vector product cannot be 0. Okay, so this option is ruled out. Scalar product I showed you before, so you know automatically this is the way it's supposed to go. And your scalar sum is 0. It really doesn't make any sense if I just add the scalar sums together, and if it gives me 0, it doesn't mean it's orthogonal. Okay, and I'm sure that that wouldn't give you a 0 either. Okay, so let's look at this. So two vectors are the orthogonal if and only if your dot product is 0. So your dot product, these are the different versions of it. So you have scalar product, inner product. Okay, so this is how you represent it in mostly in quantum mechanics. If you have two wave functions and you want to find out their orthogonal, so this is the Dirac notation of that. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. Basically, you had a non-relativistic equation, then you had your Klein-Gordon equation. This is how the story goes, okay? You have your non-relativistic case, then you have your Klein-Gordon equation, and then you have your Dirac equation. So the Dirac equation generates a non-negative probability density, negative probability density, no probability density, and only positive probability density. So what you'll realize is, okay, once you start doing your calculations, okay, so this is all big derivations that you do, you realize you're going to get a negative probability density, okay? So you realize that it can be either positive or it can be negative, okay? When you do the Klein-Gordon equation, it can be positive or it can be negative. Okay, so let's look at this. So these are basically the difficulties that are faced with your relativistic Klein-Gordon equation. Okay, so remember this, your Klein-Gordon is basically for a spin 0, your Dirac is basically for your spin half particle or your electron, okay? So we start seeing negative energies of a free particle once we solve the Klein-Gordon equation, okay? And your probability density is not necessarily a positive quantity. It can be positive, but and also be negative. Okay, so now this is a table, a very nice table, probably that you should remember this so that it's easy for you to solve the problem. Okay, so what you these are all the probability densities that you have. Okay, and these are the current densities that you have. It's not really related to the question, but I thought it's a really nice table to actually remember how you you can actually remember these terms. So I remember my teacher telling me that psi dagger and psi are basically bodyguards to the alpha, so that you get a number. Okay, so I remember her telling me that in class. Okay, so this is your non-relativistic case. This you got your psi square, and this also you should know. I hope you remember that I goofed up this formula last time. I ended up putting a divergence over here. So maybe that way you can remember that, oh, I did it wrong, so that you can remember it this way. So you have a minus IH cross divided by 2m psi star del psi minus psi del psi star. You have a Klein-Gordon equation which gives you this relation. Okay, and then you have a Dirac equation. Okay, over here I think I have made a typo here somewhere, so I'll get back to you on this part. Okay, I will correct the notes and then I will send it to you. Okay, now the notion of antiparticles is based on the solutions of. Okay, so I think you know about this because there are terminologies like Dirac sea that come up. So C, basically you have a sea of anti-electrons, okay, or positrons that are there. Okay, so is it the Klein-Gordon equation? Is it the Dirac equation, the Schrödinger equation, and the Schrödinger equation? So it's going to be the Dirac equation because he basically came up with this concept of positrons and things like that. Okay, so now here, okay, so what we see is when we solve the Dirac's equation, we start getting negative energy states. Okay, so we start getting energy states, basically something like E is equal to minus root of P square C squared plus M squared C to the power of 4. Okay, so you start getting negative energy states like this, which extend from your minus MC squared to about minus infinity. And then you start getting positive energy states too, which is basically E plus root of P square C squared plus M square C to the power of 4 from plus MC squared to about plus infinity. Okay, so these are your positive energy states of the electron, and these are the negative energy states of the electron. So you end up getting a delta E over here, which is equal to 2mc squared. Okay, so now what Dirac said was there's never going to be a situation where some particle at from this C comes out. Okay, so he called it the negative energy C. Okay, and nothing from the positive energy states can come here. Okay, this is not possible because all these are already filled up. Okay, and then what I'd like to talk about is, just a second, let me clear all these. Okay, so now what I'd like to talk about is what happens when you have a electron from your negative C, okay, or your positron from your C go up there. Okay, so with the required amount of energy, you are able to get this guy out of that C. Okay, and then it comes up to the positive energy state. Okay, so this is basically your electron positron pair production that's being talked about. And there's another one where you have a radiation that's being emitted once these two particles come together. That's your annihilation. Okay, that we're going to be talking about. So this is your electron positron annihilation that is there here. Okay, so here a radiation is being emitted. In the other case, your radiation was absorbed. So let's look at this again. The notion of antiparticles is based on the solutions of the Dirac equation because you end up having negative and positive solutions for it. And what did he say with all these negative solutions? He said there is basically like this unbreakable sea of electrons that are there. Okay, but if you apply a required amount of energy, you can break one of them from this negative sea and put it up to the positive state. Okay, so why can't we take an electron from the positive. Okay, so basically you draw it like this. Okay, so these are your positive energy states and your negative energy states. Now, why can't we take an electron from the positive here and put it here to the negative? Okay, so the reason is this: all these are fermions. Okay, so since all these are fermions, you all know, okay, Pauli's exclusion principle, no two electrons can sit in the same state, right? So the reason you can't take an electron and put it here is because this C is basically filled, okay? You cannot fill any more into it. But what you can do is take one from here and put it up here, okay? So you can take one from the negative C and put it here because the positive energy states are not filled, okay? They are not filled, so you can take one from your negative energy C and put it up on top. Okay, so now that is done. Let's move to the next question. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is, the reason I decided not to take the electronics question today is because I want to talk about your phase transitions. So I'll probably do it tomorrow, or if there are no like really extensive topics that haven't been done, I'll take it on some other day. So there's one question still pending, so just remember that. Okay. Now, a second order phase transition is characterized by a latent heat, a change in volume, a discontinuous change in a specific heat, or an irreversible behavior during cooling and warming. Okay. So now what I will do is I will give you some short notes on phase transitions because I feel like it's never been really grilled into our heads. Okay. So maybe you have a little bit of that in BSc, but not in MSc. Okay. That topic is completely like wiped out. Okay. So what are phases? So when we talk of phases, we basically think of liquid, solid, gas. Okay. But there are other phases like plasma, which is not very talked about. There are also phases. You think that the superconducting or the things like, what do you call, superfluids, all those kinds of things are not basically phases. They're basically phenomenon for you. Okay. But they too are phases. So you have superconducting phases and you have magnetic states. Those are all phases as well, okay? So that's one thing that many people get wrong. Another thing that you have here is your first order and second order phase transition. So states of matter with their stability regions in the phase diagram. So phase diagram is basically your PT diagram, okay? That I will show you how it looks like for water. The properties of these microstates change by definition at the phase boundary, okay? So this change, okay? So what you're supposed to look at, what properties change, okay? That's what you're supposed to look at. So this change is discontinuous for a first order phase transition and continuous for a second order phase transition. Discontinuous for a first order, continuous for a second order. Okay, so this is how your phase diagram looks like, okay? So you have a solid, you have a liquid, you have a gas, okay? There are 2 points to be noted here, which people get confused. Some people think the critical point is the triple point. No, the critical point is something here. And this is a critical point because beyond this region, you're starting to see or observe second order phase transitions rather than first order ones, okay? So now there is an interesting phenomenon if you've observed, okay? If you've seen people skating in ice rinks, okay? Their skating boots is basically, that's something that looks like, okay, so you have your skating boot. My diagrams are horrible, I know. Okay, so basically you have a thin layer, okay, a thin layer of steel, or I don't know, I think it's made of steel. Okay, so you have a thin layer of steel that gets pushed onto your ice. Okay, that gets pushed onto your ice. And for a moment there, it creates a small, tiny layer of water. Okay, and I'll tell you why. Because we'll understand from this phase diagram of water what it actually means. For a small amount of time, it's going to make a layer of water so that the skater can slide, okay, through the ice rink. And other thing that you see is basically, I'm hoping that you've seen experiments like this. So people take a block of ice and they put a thin wire on top of it, okay? So what they see is that this wire gets pulled down, okay? But as soon as this wire gets pulled down, okay, they form your ice back, okay? So basically, it's something to do with pressure, okay? So at some suitable temperature T, okay, let's say it's something here, let's say T, on increasing your pressure, what happens is the solid becomes a liquid. Okay, so as you increase your pressure here, the solid becomes a liquid, and then you get a thin layer of liquid there. Okay, so as soon as the pressure goes away, it comes back here and becomes a solid again. So that's basically how this experiment and this skating in an ice rink and all those kinds of things actually come about. Okay, by changing the pressure a small bit, this solid starts to become a liquid. Okay, so now let's go on to this. Okay, so another thing that I would explain about is a critical point. Okay, so the first order phase boundary between the gas and the liquid, this is basically the border that they're talking about, and this is the critical point. Okay, so between your gas and liquid becomes a second order right at the critical point. The two phases have then equal densities and specific entropies, or entropy per particle. Okay, specific entropy, entropy per particle. That's what it basically means. There is no critical point for the liquid solid transition. Okay, so look over here, you have a critical point here, but for your liquid solid transition, there's no critical point that comes about here. Okay, there's a critical point here, there's a triple point here that we're talking about. Okay, so this is a skating on ice that I mentioned to you about. So now let's look at this. Okay, so this is your first order phase transition that I'm going to talk about. So when your water starts boiling, basically you have a phase transition from the liquid to the gas phase. Okay, for both phases. So let's just partially divide this. So you've got a liquid and you've got a gas. Okay, so both of these phases have basically, let's just put F of L of X and G of X. Okay, to refer to liquid and gas. So both of these phases, what happens? They are both well-defined regular functions which are continuous. Okay, and they have continuous derivatives. Okay, so these are also continuous. Okay, so basically people have this misconception where they think that it's going from a continuous function to a discontinuous function. No, okay, that's not what's happening. It's going from one continuous function to another continuous function. Okay, so that's completely different from them. They abruptly change from one continuous function, this is continuous, this is continuous, they're changing from one continuous function to another continuous function. So that kind of a transition is a transition of first order. Okay, so this Gibbs enthalpy term is a very important term. Okay, so it's something to do with your first order, and basically how the derivatives of this Gibbs enthalpy change tell you about the order of the phase transitions. Okay, so I don't think I'll be discussing that today, but maybe if I find it relevant further on when I go through it, I'll probably tell you how to check what order the phase transition is in. Okay, so basically you just take the derivative of your Gibbs enthalpy with respect to a particular quantity, and the order of that derivative tells you about the order of the transition. Okay, so this is the phase transition. Basically, you have your PT phase diagram, which we kind of like looked at, and it's described by Gibbs enthalpy. So let's just review what we've learned before. Okay, so let's use that and then try to kind of like get the answer. Okay, so I told you about this mnemonic, right? Like great physicists have studied under very fine teachers. Okay, so I put a negative here, I put a negative here, and what did I do? I have a DG that comes up. I take this on both the whatever letters come up on both the sides. I write up DP, I write DT. Okay, and what do? I take T, I write my minus S. Okay, and I write along with P, what do I have? I've got a V. Okay, now in certain cases there's going to be a plus mu dn that comes up, which is basically your number of particles, and this is basically referring to a chemical potential that you have. Okay, so now what are the things that vary when I have my dg? Okay, so basically the variants are pressure, temperature, and n. Okay, so you have pressure, temperature, and n. So if you want to know what the variables are for any thermodynamic potential, use the thermodynamic square. Okay, so whatever is to the side of your thermodynamic potential, whatever thermodynamic state variable is to the side of the thermodynamic potential will give you the function of that particular potential. So what it is basically dependent on. And this mu dn comes for all the thermodynamic potentials. Your plus mu dn comes for all of them. Okay, so that's something that's there in common. Okay, so this is like to review what we've done before so that it stays in your head, and also to figure out ways not to remember but to actually derive things out. Okay, quickly, not taking a long time but quickly. Okay, so GTPN changes continuously across the phase boundary when the transition is of the first order, but your entropy and your volume, okay, which are the derivatives of the Gibbs potential, are in contrast discontinuous. So let's look at that. Okay, so what did we write down before? We wrote down dg is equal to v dp minus s dt. Okay, so they're saying that the derivatives are discontinuous. Okay, so what do you mean by that? You have a dou g divided by dou, what do you get here? Okay, I can write this as p at constant t. Okay, it should be equal to volume. Okay, so I'm able to express volume as a derivative of the Gibbs potential or Gibbs enthalpy. And what about the other one? I take a minus s is equal to dou g divided by dou t. I hope you know how I'm writing this. This is basically this is basically different, trying to get the differential of a function. Okay, so basically when you write dg and I say it's a variant of t and p, I basically get dou g divided by dou p into dp plus dou g divided by dou t into dt, right? And then I compare these two equations, and then I kind of like write down what are the what the thermodynamic state variables are in terms of my thermodynamic potential. Okay, so this is what you get. So you're able to write your entropy and volume in terms of these Gibbs potential. Okay, so the Gibbs potential itself is not discontinuous, it's continuous along that phase boundary, but the entropy and volume are discontinuous. Okay, so let's move to the next thing. Okay, so now this is a definition of latent heat. Okay, so here I have, if I have two phases 1 and 2 which are coexisting at a temperature T0, okay, to have different entropies S1 and S2, what do? I take the system must absorb heat or release heat. Okay, there must be this latent heat which is given by delta QL, and you have T0 into S2 minus S1. Okay, so this is for a first order transition. Okay, so latent heat is basically associated with your first order transition. So just to kind of like complete the whole thing, we're not using that here right now. Okay, so these are the properties which you need to remember for your first order and second order transitions. Okay, so g of pt is continuous, but the derivatives of that is not continuous, it's discontinuous. Also, there is a latent heat that occurs in your first order transitions. Okay, that exists. This symbol means that exists latent heat. Okay, now let's look at your second order transition. So here 2g of tp is continuous. Your second order derivatives, or your first order derivatives of your g are continuous. So this is basically what I told you about. Okay, if I get a discontinuous derivative coming up along any of the first order or second order or third order derivative, that order basically refers to your second order. That order basically refers to your nth order of your phase transition. So in your first order, you realize that the first order derivative, what did you get? You get a p, right? Okay, so you realize that first order itself is discontinuous. Okay, next you take some other order. Then you realize this second order is going to be discontinuous in your second order transition. So your S and T remain as continuous here. Okay, so the discontinuities in the second transition leads to the discontinuities in the response functions. So what are these response functions? Let's look at that. Okay, so the discontinuities in the second order derivative of your g of pt. Okay, here you look at this. Okay, let's just analyze this for a second. I'm going to cross the time today, I know, but if you're a little busy, you can leave. But if you really want to know about this, just stay and listen. Okay, so here what do you have? So you have dou s divided by dou t, right? So you have dou s divided by dou t. How did you write your s? You wrote your s of minus dou g divided by dou t, right? At constant p. This is how you wrote your s. So you realize that you're getting a second order derivative here. Okay, so that's how this comes up here. So your Cp is basically going to be given by this. And what is Cp? Cp is your specific heat at constant pressure. Okay, so now let's go back to the question. Okay, and I'll come back to this point later. Okay, so let's go back to the question. Let's read it again. Okay, so since you know so much, let's try to solve this. A second order phase transition is characterized by what? Okay, the first order is going to be continuous in your second order phase transition. Okay, the first order, basically a volume change is going to be continuous. Your latent heat does not exist in your second order here. Okay, this doesn't matter. What matters is this. Okay, a discontinuous change in the specific heat. Why? Because your specific heat of the second order transition is the second order derivative of your Gibbs potential or Gibbs enthalpy. Okay, so now let's get back to that. Okay, so the other terms that I want to talk about here are, okay, just a second. Okay. So the other terms that I want to talk about here are this, okay? So this KT basically refers to your isothermal compressibility, okay? So this is your isothermal compressibility. I've seen in some of these MCQs that they just ask for this term, okay? They basically ask, how does the relation look like? For now, let's just remember it this way, okay? So you have a V over here, you have a dou V divided by dou P at constant temperature. So let's just remember it like that, okay? So your dou V divided by dou P, let's just remember it that way for now, and we'll get back to it later on, okay? So if I take all of this, we're going to run short of time. Now, what is your alpha? Your alpha is basically the thermal expansion coefficient, okay? Thermal expansion coefficient. And what you realize is that all of these are the second order derivatives of your GTPM, okay? So let's move to the next one. Okay, so this is the reason that we had. It was option C, your specific heat jump. Your phase transitions in the second order show a finite discontinuity in the specific heat, CP. Okay, so this is relating to the superconducting states and superfluids and things like that. Okay, so your second order transitions basically deal with those kind of processes. Now, in the process of phase transition, Gibbs function remains constant. Only entropy remains constant, only volume remains constant, only temperature remains constant. What did we see in the first order transition? We saw discontinuities in your entropy and your volume, okay? So let's rule out all that, okay? What did we see in the second order transition? So we kind of remember that only your Gibbs function basically remains continuous, okay? There is another way to think about this process. Okay, another way to think about this process is basically this way. You have your Gibbs function here remaining constant. So the Gibbs free energy is not necessarily zero at phase change. Okay, it's not zero, but the change is zero. The Gibbs energy itself is not zero. It's like G is not zero, but DG is zero. Okay, but since your Gibbs function depends naturally on the thermodynamic variables P and T, since common phase transition occurs at a constant P and T, the Gibbs function tends to be constant during the phase change. Okay, so the Gibbs function remains constant during the phase change because you have a constant P and T. Now, let's look at this. This is very important, okay? Your change in your Gibbs function is zero, but the Gibbs function may not be zero. So your dG is zero. That means what? Your G is a constant, okay? That means your G cannot be zero, okay? It's some constant value that you have. Okay, so let's look at this. We've got about 3 more questions to go, okay? Now, which of the following is an example of the first order transition? I told you things like superconductivity, superfluids, all those kinds of things are going to be second order transitions, okay? And whenever you go past the critical point, okay, you're going to be getting second order transition. So let's look at this, okay? A liquid gas phase transition at the critical point, a liquid gas phase transition away from the critical point, a normal metal superconductor transition, okay? A normal liquid helium to superfluid helium transition. So basically this is your option B, okay? So your first order transition at the boundary between your gas and your liquid becomes a second order at the right of the critical point. Okay, so the two phases have then equal densities and specific entropies. Next, when you're looking at this, your metal conductor transition and your normal liquid helium to your superfluid helium, all these are your second order transition. So now what do you basically mean by a superfluid is, I don't know if you've seen these pictures, basically you put a helium in a cup and you can see your helium flowing outward, okay, out of that bowl. And the other thing that I want to talk about is your superconductor. What you basically mean is it loses all electrical resistance for your when you have a superconductor, basically you lose all electrical resistance. So let's move on to the next question. Okay, so the transition of helium-4 from the normal liquid state to the helium to the superfluid state is known as what? Okay, is it a beta transition, lambda transition, Bose-Einstein condensation, or your Zeeman effect? So this is a particular thing to do with it. Okay, I'll tell you what the answer is. This is called the lambda transition. Okay, and there's a reason why it's called the lambda transition. So all material like your superconductors, your liquid crystals, and your superfluids, okay, they basically come under the category of lambda transitions. And the reason why they're called lambda transitions is basically because you have a CP versus temperature graph, okay? And what you realize is that it looks like a lambda, okay? So the curve goes something like that. It looks like a lambda, and that's why they're called lambda transitions for all your superfluids, your superconductors, and all those liquid crystals and things like that, okay? So that's what you see, okay? So let's just explore this a little bit more. Okay, now the instinct for any person to do is say it's Bose-Einstein condensate, okay? So that's not the right answer. You're looking at a transition. They've said transition here too. So you'll have to pick up lambda transitions. Okay, so let's explore this out. The formation of the superfluid is known to be related to the formation of a Bose-Einstein condensate, okay? This is understood by the fact that superfluidity occurs in helium-4 at far higher temperatures than it does in your helium-3, okay? So each atom of your helium-4 is a boson because of its zero spin, whereas your helium-3 is a fermion particle which can form bosons by pairing with itself at much lower temperatures. Okay, this is similar to your superconductivity. Okay, so that's why all of these things that I talked about, your superconductivity, superfluids, and your liquid crystals come under the same category of lambda transitions. Okay, so the phase change to superfluidity, which liquid helium undergoes to. Okay, it's so named because of the shape of your specific heat versus temperature curve, which resembles the Greek letter lambda. Okay, so it's similar to this lambda symbol. So that's why they call it lambda transition. So this is how your curve actually looks like, your CP versus T. It's kind of like a lambda shape. Okay, so you expect to see an exact line here. That's not how it looks. It's a little different from the actual shape of your lambda. Okay, so now this is very simple. Okay, very simple if you know what it really means. Okay, so the phenomenon of diffusion is only in gases, only in liquids, solids only, and solids, liquids, and gases. So immediate instinct is how can how can diffusion occur in solids? Okay, so let's explore that possibility. So in your solids, your diffusion is basically due to thermally activated random motion of atoms. So there can be diffusion in solids too. Okay. So whenever we learned in high school, you just, you enter your chemistry lab and you just say that, okay, fine, maybe in gases. Okay, fine, let's extend it to liquids. But here, when you're looking at it in a deeper view, we start to extend it to solids too. Okay. So here your individual atoms keep vibrating and it keeps on moving within the material. Okay. Now, diffusion basically occurs in all forms of matter, okay? And it corresponds to a stochastic evolution, and it is in basically when you apply a force, you end up getting these kind of situations, okay? So these are basically random processes that occur, okay? So I think you might have come up with this word in your non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, okay? So let's move to the last one. Okay, so this is something that you have to remember. Okay, this is not taught anywhere in your syllabus and things like that, but I was able to get a graph which could kind of, help you remember about these transducers. I think we've done a little bit of transducers in the what was that paper called? Experimental Techniques in Physics. Okay, so there was a little bit of transducers over there, and but I don't think this was discussed at length. Okay, so the temperature transducers exhibit non-linear behavior. The order in which they exhibit non-linearity, your highest to lowest, is thermocouple. RTDs are basically your resistance temperature detectors and your thermistors. Okay, so they want to see the non-linearity. Okay, so when I'm going to show you the graph, the orders are going to be a little bit different, and we'll explore it as it comes. Okay, so don't immediately picture the graph and write it in the order that it is. Okay, we have to like explore it a bit. Okay, so these are the options that are given to you. Okay, so let's just look at what transducers are. Okay, so basically what transducers do, it converts one form of an energy to another. Okay, so here if you have a temperature transducer, what it does, it takes the thermal energy and it converts it into any physical quantity like your mechanical energy, pressure, and your electrical signals and things like that. Okay, so let's look at what happens in a thermocouple. So there's an electric potential difference that is produced due to difference across the terminals. So basically it helps find out the electrical potential difference because of the temperature difference. That's it, kind of like widens sort of. Okay, now the next one is your thermistor, which is basically a resistor which depends on your temperature. And resistance temperature detectors are basically sensors that are used to measure temperature. Okay, so your thermistors have two types. So basically you have positive coefficient, negative temperature coefficient thermistors. Basically what happens is the resistance decreases when your temperature increases in such cases. And then you have a positive temperature coefficient thermistor where your resistance increases as the temperature increases. So now immediately when I show you the figure, you're going to be writing the order as thermistor, RTD, and your thermocouple. Okay, so that is not how you look at it. Okay, so this is a curve that shows you what. Okay, let's look at it. This is a curve that shows you about non-linearity. It also shows about sensitivity. Okay, so let's draw a line here. Okay, now what are they asked in the question? I'll go back and show you what they've asked in the question for a while and then come back here. Okay, so what are they asked you in the question? The temperature transducers exhibit non-linear behavior. Okay, rank it from the highest to the lowest. Okay, non-linear behavior. So basically what you're looking at here is, okay, so you've got a linear curve here which exhibits the which is the most closest to that line. Okay, let's look at that. Which is the most closest to that line? Your RTD is most linear. Okay, why? Look at it. Okay, so it's closest to this kind of a form. Okay, so it's closest to the linear form. So your RTD is the most linear. Now let's look at your thermocouple. Okay, so the thermocouple is the next most linear. So you write down thermocouple. Okay, you're talking about most linear, remember that. Okay, next what you do here is you got a thermistor. Okay, so when you got a thermistor, what is basically looking at? You have a thermistor and this is basically like this. Okay, so it's most deviated from this linear form. Okay, so this guy comes at the end, your thermistor. Okay, so what do you have? Your order of linearity. Okay, the question asks you for non-linearity, but the order of linearity here is your RTD, thermocouple, and thermistor. It's going to be the other way around when you're looking at non-linearity. So you have your thermistor, thermocouple, and RTD. So that's what we have here. Okay, so that is basically your option B. You have your thermistor, thermocouple, and RTD. Okay. So I think we've done with today. Now I think that was a very quick recap on your phase transitions. Okay, so now I still have one electronics question pending from the second lecture or the third lecture. I don't quite recall. It's on counters. Please revise counters. I've sent you the video sets already for that. Now about this, I think you should probably go ahead and read some kind of like book. Probably you could take up uh, you could probably take up a couple of PDFs from MIT and kind of like check it out. Okay, so there's this website called your MIT Open Courseware where you basically get all your lecture notes. But the thing is, that's going to be a little harder to understand because they're going to be teaching at a whole different level. So you could probably check about your phase transitions, okay, your first order and your second order phase transitions. Revise the thermodynamic square, revise all those potentials, try to just keep doing them on your own. The next thing is I kind of like received a suggestion for doing model papers, and I kind of discussed this with Usha ma'am, and she said there are no model papers that are available for KSET as far as she's concerned with it. So she said just keep doing this. Okay, so basically the idea is when you're kind of like what I told you yesterday, right? So let's just review about this. I told you about the error bounds formula, which had your basically gave you the error bounds for your Simpsons method, your Simpsons, what else is that? Trapezoidal, yeah, trapezoidal and midpoint. So your Simpsons varied as a h power 4, the error varied as your h power 4, trapezoidal varies as a h power 3, the other one that you have your midpoint varies as a h power 2. So what I realized is that the next set of papers that you're going to get basically has a question on trapezoidal, okay? So basically there they're given all these same options that you have, your h power 2, h power 3, h power 4, and they've asked you to find out what is your error approximately equal to. So since you know these formulas and since I keep kind of like expanding on the topics a little bit, I think you should be able to crack it, okay?